Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Definitely Gospel Centered. I am your host, Gaby Duke, and here we have real talk, real conversations in American Sign Language. Today's conversation I'm just so excited for. It's going to be with my dear friend, Dee Collins, and we're going to be talking about generational forgiveness. So, just so excited about that. I met Dee through the organization Millennial Project. She is just an amazing and faithful follower of Jesus. And I just love learning from her and hearing the different stories she has to share. She's been a missionary to the deaf, and she just has some crazy stories, let me tell you. She recently started a blog. It's called Knotted Tapestry. For any of you just interested in learning more about her and her journey. So Dee, so grateful and excited to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here as well.
For sure. So I know a few weeks ago, you had actually mentioned in a group chat this topic, generational forgiveness. And I remember seeing this and thinking how good of a conversation this could be. It's so interesting too because my mother and I recently had a discussion on generational forgiveness. So I think it was perfect timing.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
So Dee, when we're talking about generational forgiveness, can you expound upon what that means?
Yeah. So I don't know if the topic of generational forgiveness, is that real or is it just more my perspective? I'm not sure. And I've been trying to figure that out. So I've been trying to gain more knowledge about it by doing research, looking online. But that concept for me started when I was studying the Israelites. And back in biblical times, their decision to be led out of Egypt and wander for 40 years. Many of them died on that journey. They didn't make it to the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about their children. And as their children became adults. But that generation made it into the promised land. But the first generation of Israelites did not. Because most of them, all of them died. And the next generation made it to the promised land. So I was thinking about their children as they became adults, as they looked back on their parents' decision. Their parents' decision to rebel against God, or they decided they were too fearful. They didn't want to start a new life. So they stayed. And God said that was fine. That was their decision. But they wandered for 40 years as they set up camp, tore down camp, traveled to a new location, set up camp, tore down camp. And they did that over and over again. And I was thinking about their children as they became adults and they were looking back on their grandparents' decision and thought about how many of those children, as they became adults, were carrying that weight of their parents' and grandparents' decisions. I know that it could have changed their lives if they had obeyed God and decided to trust Him and not be fearful of the new land. But that started to make me think and do some research about the meaning of generational forgiveness.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So it means forgiving your parents, but also your grandparents. But also generational forgiveness means your children, when you look back at their parents and forgive their parents, and then their parents forgive their parents, and so forth.
So you're saying that it is a child's decision whatever they're frustrated with relating to their parents or their grandparents. They have to make that conscious decision to forgive them, right? And that is regardless if they ask for forgiveness or not. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So sometimes each generation, each family member, they have a decision to forgive the generation before them or ahead of them, even if it means they rebelled against God.
For
so it's
sure.
interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. So, just recently had a chat with my mom, or I guess it was actually, I think the last time when we started this conversation was maybe 8 years ago. Now I think about it. But I realized I had a lot of work to do related to forgiveness,
Me too.
And I recently chatted with her, and she mentioned, for her growing up, her experience with her parents, like, forgiveness was never asked for. So for her now as an adult, she realizes more that she's still learning what forgiveness looks like between parents and their children, but also just how to provide forgiveness to other people. It's just so interesting, even things she's learning now as an adult.
I feel like we have a lot of research and writing about forgiveness, forgiving each other, our family, our friends, or our bosses, or our spouses. But there's just not much about generational forgiveness.
I agree.
So I think maybe we need more information.
Yeah, for sure. So when did you realize that generational forgiveness was something we needed to discuss, that was worth recognizing?
So for me, I was thinking about last year, the pandemic. It was a tough year for all of us. And I was noticing during that time, new words started to appear. And a lot of them were negative words. And they were used often, like toxic.
Yeah.
Another one is ghosting. Cancel culture. Or Karen. The woman who causes issues, or her decision people don't like, or she causes conflict with other people, is typically labeled as a Karen. These labels that we have that have appeared are all negative. So I've been thinking about that. I'm thinking about COVID and how that was such a tough time. So I really started to do some thinking. And we have these categories.
Interesting.
So for example, we have World War I, we have World War II, and then now we have COVID, the pandemic. And they all have something in common because they had an impact globally. I know we've had different kinds of wars in our history between countries. We've had different kinds of wars, but these three categories, they all had a global impact. So I was thinking about each of these and how the people who lived through these events, like World War I, they have different experiences and stories, but their stories and experiences get passed down. That's true. They stop because soon all of them will have passed away. Their experiences, their stories don't get passed on because they get forgotten. But now moving on to World War II, you have people who are still alive that lived through that. But they have different kinds of experiences as well. They have stories and how it impacted them. It was awful. But they are starting to die, and eventually their stories will stop as well. People have forgotten about the trials that they experienced during that time. Our independence caused us to separate ourselves from each other. So then last year, the pandemic impacted the entire world. So now we have our own experiences and our stories from that. And that has increased our need to forgive.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
We need to either forgive or we do the opposite and we isolate ourselves. And America is very independent, a very independent country. So I was just thinking about each of these events and how they impacted people and the stories and the difficult times that people experienced. And I've been trying to figure out our stories and how they will continue to our next generations. And how we can learn to forgive and become closer to each other and lean into each other. And how that will impact the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people just don't
think about it. I know
you may
my
not understand our stories
growing up. I mean,
they've never experienced the things we've experienced, but that caused me to really think.
Their experience
And I thought that was
better
interesting.
And their perspective. I think forgiveness would have been a lot easier. You know, they had their own struggles that look very different from mine, but their struggles. It's important for me to learn that aspect of it. I think that's just an interesting concept that you mentioned, these categories of different times, different things that impacted the world. And I mean, I am completely clueless about the individuals who experienced World War II. I mean, sure, I know some facts and some things that were hard for some people, but I don't have a deep understanding of what that was like. Yeah, so interesting. Never really thought about that part in that way before. So, Dee, with your personal relationship with your mother and then with your children, what does that look like in your life?
Yeah, so a few years ago, I decided to go to counseling. And that decision was because I was abused growing up. And I was experiencing a lot of triggers. I noticed in work and in my personal life, things were coming back up. I felt those triggers.
Yeah,
so I
get
wanted
that.
to know why that was happening. So while I was in counseling, I started to really unpack a lot of things that I didn't like. But it helped. And I had to figure out how to resolve some of these things. And during that time, I noticed there was a lot of unfinished work for me that I needed to do. I contacted my mom and we sat down and had a conversation about my childhood and how I still had some anger against her. Because, wondering why she never stopped my dad from abusing us. And there are a list of things. But I had to figure out that and resolve that. And so as I leaned into that and leaned into our relationship, it created a closer bond between us. It was nice. And notice how we've become closer through that. And in tough times, we have to learn how to forgive and have generational forgiveness. Yeah, my mom made mistakes, but I was trying to understand her perspective
Yeah.
and why the things that happened, and why she didn't feel like she had the power to stop my dad from abusing us.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
was trying to understand
Absolutely.
her
I think
perspective, and she was trying to understand
just
mine.
about my
Yes, forgiveness
relationship
is
with
tough,
both of my
but
parents.
it is
They are
required
divorced, and my
for us to move
father
forward.
has remarried. Just that fact alone required, you know, a lot of thinking of how do I navigate that concept, right? To give him forgiveness, just for the fact of deciding to, not work things out with my mother, which is what, I believe they should have done, but, he chose to remarry instead. Also, just growing up, I just know there's a lot of things my father did that I didn't necessarily agree with, not just a difference of opinion, but for moral reasons. So forgiveness needed to happen. But just like you said, we had to sit down and have that conversation. And it was talking through a lot of difficult things. It was hard. There were a lot of tears shed. However, after that took place, the healing could begin. And after that happened, I had to decide to give forgiveness. And maybe I didn't necessarily feel like it at the time, but making that conscious decision to give forgiveness enabled my emotions to follow later. So, yeah, absolutely agree with that counselor you mentioned. It's tough to dig through and unpack everything, in our past and in our hearts, but it's good. It's necessary. Yeah,
Sometimes it's also nice
absolutely.
to have two people involved. Because as you start to become more healthy and heal, it's good to have
Yeah,
someone
you're
who's kind of
right.
mediating and trying to understand their perspective. But if we're alone, the other person may not forgive us, or maybe they don't want to
Mm-hmm.
apologize. Each of us have to figure out our way of doing that. But it's our responsibility as believers that we want to become more Christ-like.
Yeah,
So that means that I have to
when
be willing
looking
to be
through
vulnerable.
the word for a specific verse for this episode, I came upon
And how to
Romans
become more like
12,
him
verse
through grace.
17. It says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone." And yeah, just forgiveness, when we decide to withhold it, it can look like we have a stone cold heart, right? That we're not able to forgive and move forward. It can look kind of evil to some of us, when we just put a barrier up against people and we decide to be self centered and live for just ourselves. It doesn't look like Christ when you think about it. And so I'm just kind of curious now, Dee, when we're talking about this durational forgiveness, we talked about how that looks like with your mom. What does that look like with your children now?
Yeah, so I think with parents and children, it's very similar. My parents have to forgive
Mm.
me. I have to forgive
Mm-hmm.
them, but that also applies to me forgiving my children, and then my children have to forgive me. It's kind of like this transaction between generations. So I have three children. My two older ones are married, and then so I have two daughter-in-laws. And each of them are different. And I have to approach all of them very differently. And I'm still learning how to do that. I'm still learning how to be a better mom still today. My two oldest are out of the house and married. The oldest has his own kids now. So I've been trying to figure out that boundary. How do I continue to love them? And sometimes I mess up. And I have to admit it. I have to confess that. But most of the time, I don't know. And we as parents are guessing most of the time. I think that's right, and then we do it, and then we learn and think, okay, that was a mistake. That was not what I was supposed to do. So that still is happening for me with even my oldest children. So sometimes I have to approach them and say, do you mind having this conversation with me? I'm sorry I messed up. And of course, they're always very, very compassionate with their responses, and they tell me that I'm a great mom. But each of them handle that very differently. I try to continue to be a good example to them.
Yeah.
I try to not hold grudges against them, and I want to forgive them as well. I don't hold those records of wrongs against them. We all have to learn how to forgive each other, and it's not easy.
Yeah, I love that, Dee. Really, I feel just encouraged by how you approach forgiveness. And I just think about just me in my own life, just looking at other women who've already walked that road. It helps me so much.
It's not easy. But I have to really be honest with myself and be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And admit that I'm wrong. And say I'm weak in this area and apologize for those things. Yeah. We mess up.
Well, right now I have 2 boys that are 5 and 2, and trying so hard to show that forgiveness. If I'm frustrated about their behavior, but also at the same time, even when they're misbehaving, I know my attitude on the inside can be wrong too. So it's such a good reminder just for me to hold on to. And I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about grace and mercy. Dee, do you feel like we are, in this generation, losing an ability to show grace and mercy?
Yeah. So I've been going to different churches recently and hearing different sermons, different messages, different preaching styles. Mm-hmm. And last year during COVID, a lot of the sermons that I heard were very similar. They were talking about our nation, our country, how we've lost the ability to have mercy. And at first I was like, really? But it's been increasing our tolerance for each other. And pastors, preachers who are preaching have been saying that we've lost this ability to have mercy on each other. So I started to think about this. Mercy is the ability to be willing to try to understand the other person and forgive them. So I have my way of doing things, but maybe a person has a different culture or a different way they grew up, different way of doing things. But if I don't try to understand the perspective, and I try to be independent and do my own thing and have my own rights, then I isolate myself from them. I remember there was another story in the Bible Jesus was speaking to a group of people. I think it's in Matthew 25. And he was telling the story about there were servants. There was a man who had some servants, and Jesus said that their master was leaving, and so he decided to give each of his servants some coins. He told them to invest their coins, and he explained that to them. So the master left, and he came back, and he asked each of them, where did you invest your coins? And they all explained. They said yes. All of them said yes, but the last one said no. They said that they kept the coins. They didn't invest them because they were fearful of losing those coins. And so Jesus explains and says, the person that doesn't invest that Jesus punished them and that told them that they should invest. Each of us have gifts from the Lord. We all have gifts. And we need to use those gifts. That's part of investing what God's given us. Kind of like the coins. We can use those gifts for his kingdom. So if I decide that I'm fearful and I don't want to invest my gifts and I keep them to myself because I'm too fearful of what maybe other people may think of me, or maybe I think I'm not good enough, so let's say that person's so fearful that they stop investing their gifts and they keep them to themselves. Then the next generation, they don't have access to that gift. They don't experience their stories of that person, their investment. And they don't get to learn about the Lord through those gifts.
Yeah.
And it stops. So whatever gifts that we are given, if we keep them to ourselves, they don't get to be experienced by other people. They don't get passed on to the next generation. But the point of the gospel is for us to go out and make disciples of all nations. We need to be telling everyone about his great works. So imagine if that message stopped. What if I kept that to myself because I was too fearful? So it's the same concept with generational forgiveness. If I decide I don't want to forgive other people that have hurt me, and yeah, sometimes it hurts. I do get hurt. But can you imagine the Israelites, how they wandered for 40 years, and their children, as they became adults, had their own children. Can you imagine if they had stopped forgiving each other? Stopped forgiving that next generation?
You're right.
So moving forward, we have these things about generational forgiveness, about forgiving each other. We have to be willing to confess.
So Dee, what would you say is a good advice to encourage just the older generation to give forgiveness, but also the younger generation? What would be your encouragement to each?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. So imagine I have a pie. And so that pie is our life. And it has 8 pieces. So let's say 2 pieces of that pie are where my weaknesses are. Maybe I don't like other people, or maybe I'm selfish. So let's say those are the 2 areas I'm weak in. But the other 6 I'm strong in, and they're positive things, and I want people to see those things. And I want to say that I'm a good person. I think, okay, yes, these 2 parts I'm weak in, but we don't need to focus on those. Look at these other 6 parts, these other 6 pieces that are good. So, but that's not a believer's perspective. If you compare it to a believer, we have a different perspective. So we have the same life, we have the same pie. It has 8 pieces. But what's different is all 8 of those pieces are not perfect. All 8 pieces are weak. And we need God and His strength. We need Christ in us to change us. His grace, His forgiveness. Because all of us, all of our 8 pieces are not good. But the world's perspective says that, oh, I have these 6 strengths, these 6 good pieces, but these other 2, we can just ignore those. But the believer's perspective is different. We all have weaknesses, and we're not perfect. And one day we'll be in heaven together with Christ eternally. And in that day, we will be perfect. But we have to remember, on this side of heaven, we're not good. We all have parts of the pie that are not good.
I love that imagery you gave us, Dee. It just brings so much for us to be able to really grasp and try to understand. And I think, too, that humility is so required in this process.
Yes.
But thank you so much, Dee, for just your honesty and vulnerability and sharing your heart with us, and to recognize this need for generational forgiveness, and even in sharing us these different categories that you mentioned of different things people have gone through throughout the time. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your willingness to join us today.
Yes, I enjoyed being part of this.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me today.
So thank you all to our viewers who are watching this episode. If you have any questions, any comments, please reach out and let us know. You can comment on Instagram or Facebook. And remember that this season is, about everything just to do with relationships. So we still have more episodes for you guys. So we'll see you 2 weeks from today. Bye, all.
Bye.